Hello and welcome to this Adobe Photoshop tutorial where I'm going to show you how to start with an image such as this and change it to something like this, and then an image collage such as this. Let's get started with the initial image. Here is my base layer. First, I'm going to make a copy of the layer in your Layers panel. If you don't have that open, it's under Window, Layers. I'm going to drag and drop to the plus sign. I'm going to turn off this background layer now. And with this top layer selected, let's go to the Quick Selection tool, which is W for shortcut. And up here at the top, it says Select Subject, or you can go to Select and Subject here. With this image, there's pretty good contrast between the sky and the background. If we zoom in with our zoom tool, Z, we can take a closer look at how well this quick selection has highlighted our image. So right here we can see that part of the bag is not selected. So holding down Shift, we can select a little bit more of his silhouette. So that's looking good. Let's go ahead and click the mask icon, which is this rectangle with a cutout circle. And now we're going to place a new background image behind. So here is our winter scene image. I'm going to drag and drop that onto the canvas. And it's currently above the guy, but that's okay. Let's go ahead and resize it to fill the canvas. Holding down Option and Shift, we can scale proportionately from the center and hit Enter to approve and apply. Now we're going to click and drag the layer below the guy, and you can recompose using your move arrow if you want to move this guy compositionally. Now, if we look closely at this man and the background, you can see he has a bit more saturation and warm tones versus this background is grayer, slightly bluer. We're going to click on the background layer, so we're below the winter scene. And down here at the bottom, click this black and white circle symbol, and we want solid color. So what this is doing is creating a full color layer, and in the dialog box, we can sample colors from any of the layers on top. So as you see, if I click and drag, it's sampling these colors. What we want is a sample from the background, kind of a middle ground, bluish gray color, and click OK. And now we're going to move this to the top. Now we're going to click on this drop down where it says Normal, and that's going to give us some blending mode options on how it's applying that color to the layers below. So what we really want to do is just change the color or the hue of this guy. So let's select color. We want this color to only apply to this layer. So between layers, holding down Option, you'll see this black arrow symbol. Go ahead and click, and now you can see that color is applying only to this layer below. Let's bring the opacity down. We don't want him to be completely monochromatic. You can see as we use this slider, the level of opacity of that color on the layer. Let's choose something like 40, and you can type in that value as well. So we can turn off and on the layer to compare the before and after. What I want you to notice next as I zoom in is that we have a really harsh contrast between the silhouette and the background. So what I want to do next is click on this masked layer and right click and convert to Smart Object. Next, we're going to go to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur, and you can adjust this slider to give more or less blur to the image. We really only want a subtle blur, so I'm going to select, let's go with 1.8 pixels, and that's going to differ based on the image size and resolution. Click OK. Now, since this layer is a smart object, this filter is editable versus if we applied it to a raster image, we would have no way to undo later. So with the smart filter white thumbnail selected, I want you to go to Command or Control I, which will inverse the mask, or you can do that by going to Image Adjustments, Invert. So now we're going to use the brush tool, B for shortcut, and let's check our size and hardness. We do want a soft round brush, and the opacity up here, let's bring it down to 50% and make sure white is in the foreground. You can either click the arrows or the shortcut is X to toggle between the foreground and background colors. And with white as the foreground, I'm going to start painting around the masked silhouette. So I'm just clicking and painting, and his face is more of the focal point, so we don't want to really blur that. If you need to unpaint any of that, you can just toggle to black as the foreground, and that will remove from the mask layer. All right, that's looking better. The next thing I want to do is apply a Gaussian blur to the background. to create more of a depth of field, the sky being the focal point and the background being less focused. Click on the winter scene layer, and we're going to apply the Gaussian blur filter again. You can go to Blur, Gaussian blur, or you can use the most recent filter here. And now we can adjust the radius of how much blur is in the background. I'm going to go with 1.4 and click OK. And now we've achieved a basic composition. So this guy looks more like he blends in with the scene. Now let's take a look at this vintage postcard. And you can see here how many layers I've added, just exploring some different options and blend modes and additional composite images. Now would be a great time, if you haven't already, to go to File, Save. And since we have layers, it's going to give us the option to save as a Photoshop format. So navigate to your folder and give your file a name. In our Assets folder, let's add some of the torn paper pieces. So if I preview here, you can see the different variations to work with. I'm just going to grab a couple. You can select multiple files at one time if you'd like, and just make sure that however you place the image, make sure you don't have any harsh edges and that it appears to bleed off the canvas. And you can select any of these and then rotate it as you need to. And you can also scale it by holding Shift and clicking a corner, and hit Enter to apply, or this check mark. To begin organizing our layers, let's go ahead and select both torn paper pieces, or if you have more, and click either the folder icon or Command G to group those layers, and double click the layer text to give it a label. Now, if we think about the physicality of the paper, if this image was torn, there would be a slight shadow from the depth of the paper. And with the folder selected, we're going to click on the FX icon and go to Inner Glow. And if you notice, it added a glow on those paper layers. So now we can click on this color swatch, and you can sample from the background or click and drag your own color here to try to match the background. I'm just going to choose a dark color and click OK. And now we can play with the opacity. Full opacity looks very harsh and that doesn't look realistic. So I'm going to bring down the opacity so it's just subtle, and we can also change the size of the gradient. So realistically, it's not going to have that much feathering. So I'm going to bring down the size, again, just keeping this subtle. And the rest of the settings, I'm just leaving to the native selections. So let's go ahead and click OK. Now I want to start adding some textures to this. So I've added a folder called Textures. And here we can preview some other elements that we may want to use. So what I did before was selected one of the postage textures, and let's go ahead and drag and drop onto the canvas. If we zoom out, we can either scale this so we don't have this harsh black background, or you can always mask that out by selecting this area and clicking the mask icon. But for now, I'm just going to Option Shift or Shift and select a corner to scale this layer until there's no black background around the image. I'm going to apply that with Enter. And now we're going to go to the blend mode drop down to start playing with these overlays. I'm going to go with Multiply, and I'm going to bring down the opacity of the layer. And I'm going to need to reorganize my layers. I want the torn paper to be on the top, so I'm going to drag that to the very top above those layers. I want the postcard to be above the guy and the background scene. So I'm going to drag that layer above the color fill. And again, you can adjust this opacity, and you may want to make the layer less apparent in areas such as over this guy. So I'm going to click on the postcard layer and click the mask icon and grab the brush tool again. And here we can play with the opacity and maybe click and reduce opacity in areas. Maybe we don't want these marks on his face, but you'll see if I remove too much of that overlay, it doesn't look blended. I'm going to do Undo, and I'm going to either need to rasterize the layer to apply some healing and touch-ups, or double-click into the Smart Object to adjust it there. I'm okay with the current size of the placed image, so I'm going to right-click on the Smart Object layer and go to Rasterize Layer. And now, with the image thumbnail selected, I'm going to go to the healing brush, which is J for shortcut, bring down my brush size, and if it starts sampling spots that we don't want, we could use the stamp tool and just sample a clean area. by holding down Option, click, and we can change the opacity and soften or bring down the hardness of the brush. And you can see as I click and drag over an area, there's a plus sign that shows what part of the image I'm cloning. So I'm going to sample another area that's blank and just remove parts of those lines. So that's looking better to me. Now, since this layer is a little bit yellowed, maybe we want this torn paper to also be yellowed. And let's click on the background layer and create a new solid color. And now we're going to sample some of this yellowish tint. Now we're going to bring it all the way to the top over the torn paper group. And I'm going to clip it by holding down Option between the layers to clip the color fill to the torn paper. And now we're going to apply one of the blend modes, either color burn or multiply, and bring the opacity way down just so we get a tint. Next, let's add one of the stamps to this. I'm going to select the same one I used before, drag and drop it onto the canvas and resize it. Try to think about the proportions of what would realistically be the size, and you can rotate it. And now we need to remove this white background from the stamp. So go to our selection tool, which is W for shortcut, and I'm going to do select subject again. And you can see it's not quite getting all of the stamps. So I'm going to hold down Shift to get the plus sign and add more to the selection. If we accidentally select too much, you can hold down Option to remove parts of the selection. All right, that's looking pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and click the mask icon. And with the mask layer selected, you can always go in with the brush tool and bring the size way down using your left bracket key. Choose the brush hardness and change the opacity if needed. And now we can use the brush tool to take off. If black is in the foreground, it will subtract. If white is in the foreground, it will add. So with white in the foreground, you can see it would bring back that white background, which we don't want to do. So I'm going to do undo, Command Z, and toggle black as the foreground. And you can refine that until you're happy with the result. Another thing we can do is hold down Command or Control and click the layer mask to select that part of the layer. And we can go to Select, Modify, and we can expand and contract the selection. So I'm going to go to Contract, and I'm just going to contract the selection by 1 or 2 pixels. Click OK. And now we can reverse the selection or invert it by going to Select, Inverse. So now we're selecting everything but the stamp, and we have a slightly different selection. So it's going to take out part of this soft edge. So with that selection and white as the foreground, I'm going to do a cut. Command X, and it cut out a little bit closer, so we have a little bit harder edge. This stamp is looking pretty vibrant compared to the rest of the image. So let's add a layer above the stamp for hue and saturation. So go to the new adjustment layer and select Hue Saturation, or Vibrance would also work. And let's bring down the saturation so it's a bit more vintage colored. And I want to apply that only to the stamp. So between the layers, hold down Option and click to clip the adjustment layer to the stamp. And you can adjust that hue if you need to by double clicking and editing the properties. Or with that layer selection, you can just go to the properties. We could add a slight drop shadow to this stamp by clicking on the stamp layer and going to FX. And this time we want drop shadow. And we can change the angle of the drop shadow. You can also change the distance of where it is. You can see as I drag the slider, it's moving based on this angle of where the light is. And we want this to be a pretty sharp drop shadow. So you can see as I bring down the size, it's getting a harsher edge. And let's bring the distance much tighter and bring down the opacity. It's using the last sampled color from the outer glow we created. So just a really slight size of 3 pixels and opacity something like 26. Okay. Looking back at our other image, I've added another paper texture. I'm going to go back to my asset textures. And this time let's select one of the watercolor images, drag and drop it onto the artboard, and you can scale or rotate it as you'd like. Apply it with Enter. And now I'm going to go through the blend modes again. And I don't want a harsh line between this image and the rest of the image, so we may have to mask that out. Let's go with darken this time. Bring down the opacity just a little bit. I'm going to move the watercolor layer below the torn paper and also below the postage texture. And now I don't really want all of this color. So I'm going to add an adjustment layer for hue and saturation, bring the saturation way down. Let's do -85 and back to layers. I'm going to hold down Option to apply the saturation only to the watercolor. And you can adjust that layer if needed by double clicking or going to Properties and adjust it. Let's bring it on down even more, -95. You can see I also was exploring and applied a dot grid to one of the papers. I also wanted to show you how you can add even more depth with this bird. So in Assets, I'm going to go to the bird folder. Let's go with one of these egret images and bring it to the very top. And let's do the quick selection and select subject and apply the mask. I'm going to do a free transform, Command T, or edit free transform, right click and flip horizontally. And I'm going to scale the image holding down Shift and compose the image as you'd like. You can see we have a really harsh silhouette of the bird. So to refine the mask, I'm going to Command click on the mask and go to quick selection. And this time I'm going to click select and mask. And this is going to give us some more properties that we can refine and remove more of that black background. And up here in view, you can change how we're viewing the mask. So we want to see the layers below. So I'm going to select onion skin. And if we zoom in with the zoom tool or holding down Z, click and drag. And I'm going to bring up Smart Radius a little bit more. And let's do Shift Edge to -3% and click OK. Now we need to invert the selection by going to Select, Inverse, and making sure Mask is selected and white as the foreground. We're going to do Command X to cut. And now we have a little bit cleaner of a mask, which you can always go in and touch up with the brush tool if you need to. Next, let's add a drop shadow. So it looks like this bird is three-dimensional flying over the postcard. Now, proportion-wise, that's not going to make sense, but as a collage piece, it's going to add an interesting effect. So with the bird layer selected, go to FX and drop shadow. And you can change the sample color again if you'd like. And let's increase the opacity so we can see how it's being affected. And let's change the distance. We can also change the angle of the shadow, as you'll see moving here or in live time. And I'm going to add some blur by increasing the size and reduce the opacity. I'm going to do what I had before and have a slightly top left angle and play around with these settings. So let's go ahead and click OK. That's looking good. And we may want to desaturate that bird layer. So again, going to the adjustment layers icon, let's go to hue saturation again. Or you could use something like photo filter, where you can add a cooling filter if it matches, or you can sample your own color, and then you can increase that density or opacity. So in our layers panel, let's clip that layer to the bird by holding down Option, and now we can continue to change the properties and sample the background color. One more thing that stands out to me is the brightness of the stamp. So in my layers panel, I want to bring down the highlights. So with your move tool, you can either click to select the stamp as long as there aren't layers on top of it. Actually, it looks like I need to clip this hue saturation to just the stamp. And we could go ahead and group these layers, Command G or the folder icon. And within the group, I'm going to click on the hue saturation and add a new adjustment layer for levels. And here we can change the lightness and darkness of the stamp. We do want it only to apply to the stamp, so Option click to apply only to the stamp. And in Properties, we can adjust these little arrows on the slider until it blends a similar contrast. I'm going to bring the blacks up and the whites down a little bit. And you may also want to adjust some of the bird, like this is looking pretty dark to me. So with the bird selected, I'm going to rasterize this layer since I'm happy with the size and I don't plan to scale it any larger. I'm going to right click on the layer and rasterize layer. You can see the effect is still editable. And I can either make a copy of this if I don't want to destruct the original, duplicate the layer with Command J or drag and drop onto the plus sign, hide the original. And I'm going to come over to the burn and dodge tool, which is O for shortcut. I'm going to click and select dodge, and I'm going to dodge the midtones. And here is your opacity of how much this is lightening. So maybe we want to bring it down a little bit more so it's not too dramatic. And I'm just painting over some of the midtones. You may want to undo, Command Z. And maybe I want to darken this bright white with the burn tool and select highlights so we can darken. That was quite a bit. So I'm going to bring the exposure way down. And just paint over those areas. So I'm thinking about this light coming down from the top left and how that would hit the 3 dimension of the bird. Be sure to save often, Command S or File Save. And before I save this as a JPEG, I see a hard line between this texture and the background. So I'm going to find that texture, watercolor, and I'm going to transform, Command T or Edit Free Transform, and make sure that's blended or going off the canvas, same as up here. So now let's save this as a JPEG by going to File, Save a Copy, select JPEG, and save at a maximum quality. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial and it helped you to better understand using layers, blend modes, adjustment layers, and effects to make a composite image that's cohesive and uniform. Thanks for watching and take care.